Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to our month of March Madness Busting Myths About EC webinar. We are excited to cover with you today a couple of the common myths you've probably heard about EC, give you the facts to help you stay informed yourself and have appropriate conversations with your peers about how EC works and what it does, and add a little fun and flair with the basketball theme following the March Madness series that is just finishing up. So today we'll introduce ourselves so you know who we are in the face of EC for EC. We'll talk a bit about myth busting 101, and then looking at education within advocacy and what you can do to be prepared. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicola Brogan. I use she, her pronouns. You've probably also heard me introduce myself as Nick. I'm the Director of Operations and Research for the American Society for Emergency Contraception, and I've been with ASEC now for 8 years. I started in 2018 as a grad student doing some event planning for our annual meeting and have now flourished into this role. And I'm very excited to still be here working with young people on your EC advocacy.
Yeah, and then I'm Leah Loveday. I use she, her pronouns. I am the social media and webinar coordinator for EC for EC, started as an intern and now working to share content about emergency contraception with all of our wonderful student organizers.
Okay, so we'll get into the EC myth busting time, and Leah, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, so you might be wondering why we need to do this, or in particular, if this subject brings up different videos that you've seen. The video on the left is just an example of some EC misinformation and where you might see it, such as TikTok, Instagram Reels. And really, what this content looks like somewhat is wellness content and is part of a greater phenomena that we're going to talk about today. If Nick, you'll change the slide. So the reason that we need to practice fighting against misinformation and why this is so pertinent is that emergency contraception and just overall contraception in general are part of this movement of hormone phobia, which is a negative framing or scaremongering about hormonal contraception that is being seen on social media. When we think about where young people are getting their information, as we know, America and all over the world has limited quality sex education, and people are turning to the internet to share personal experiences, to share questions that they might have, and that's kind of one of their number one places that they're getting information. And so we're seeing a rise in this negative framing about contraception, as a study saw that 50% of TikToks on birth control itself actually encourage the discontinuation of contraceptives. And so the reason that these videos might be more harmful than we think is a lot of them are based off of personal experiences, as we all have our own unique experience with contraception, and some of what might be true to you might not be true to others, but it can spread misinformation. We see provider mistrust in terms of what our peers are saying versus what our provider is saying, as well as a rise in discussing natural alternatives such as natural family planning, and just an overall movement of that when we're talking about contraception on the internet. And so additionally, why this misinformation about contraception in general impacts emergency contraception access. It impacts both on the individual as well as the systemic level. And so when we see that people are getting harmful information about contraception and emergency contraception, they're going to be more hesitant to take it, as well as we see it harmed on systemic levels of just overall being able to access it. If somebody thinks, for example, that emergency contraception can end early pregnancies in abortifacient, the study saw that 73% of people in the study thought that a EC was the abortion pill. And so this misinformation impacts EC access due to the attacks on abortion, and as well as there's in policy, this impacts us with South Carolina tried to pass a law to restrict contraceptives based off the fact that they thought EC was abortifacient, and any sort of contraception that prevented ovulation or implementation. And so we see that information is not only harming people seeking to get EC, it might be hesitant about it, but negatively impacting policies that might expand or restrict EC access. So some more about how we're going to run today's webinar is the bracket. And so if you guys haven't seen a March Madness bracket, we're going to kind of be working through each of the myths in round one, just to kind of share more about things that you might hear on the internet or peers on your campus, politicians. And so round two, after we go over those, we'll debunk those myths with truths and facts, as well as share a little bit more about the most pertinent misinformation about EC and how to debunk that with facts that we've prepared for y'all today. And so, round three, we'll kind of go over where you can learn more about EC and why this is so important. And at the end of the bracket, we'll talk about more about why disinformation is harmful to our work and just a little wrap up on how to combat it. Okay. So for this slide, if you see the bracket to the left, these are some of the most common EC myths that we see. And so just kind of reading through it before we debunk them. So you might hear whether it's people on your campus, people in your family, conflate Plan B and just overall EC to being abortifacient or ending a pregnancy. We also see misinformation that EC is a dangerous medicine and could cause potential harm to your body. Another myth that we see is that you can only buy EC when you are over 18 years old. There's no restriction to that, as we'll get into. Another really common one that we'll go over today in depth, that is something that I've personally seen as the largest question I get on my campus is EC only working for those who weigh under 165 pounds? Another one is there's only one reliable brand of EC. So thinking about when you're handing out EC on your campus, people saying, I don't take Julie, I only take Plan B, or same things for some of the generic brands that there's only one reliable brand that they might think. You need a prescription to buy the morning after pill is another one, as well as the two final ones is I can't use EC more than once, and the morning after pill can only be taken the morning after using having unprotected sex. So those are the most common, and we'll get into debunking those in just a moment. So for the first two, Plan B is not abortifacient, and we're about to get into actually how that mechanism of action looks. So Nick has a medical background and is going to share more about that. And it's actually safer than over-the-counter medicines such as Tylenol, which is an amazing fact to reassure people when accessing EC. And so I'll turn it over to Nick.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about mechanism of action to try to help you understand more about why there is a difference between what emergency contraception does and what medication abortion does. And so recognizing that this picture can be extremely unsettling for folks, especially if they're not with a science background, because it seems a little chaotic. We will simplify this, but just to understand that emergency contraception and contraception in general works differently at different stages within your menstrual cycle. So when we're talking about emergency contraception specifically, and we're talking about the pill format, so your levonorgestrel EC that is available over the counter, your ulipristal acetate, which is the only prescription version of the EC pill, we are most concerned about where you are when it comes to ovulation in your cycle and making sure that you are pre-ovulation in order for these medications to work. So for the two medications, what matters most is the fact that you haven't ovulated yet. And the reason for that is because these two medications work at different points pre-ovulation to prevent ovulation. And so as Leah mentioned, EC is not the same thing as medication abortion. It cannot terminate an already implanted um, zygote. It can't prevent the like joining of sperm and egg. What it does is it prevents that fertilization by happening by preventing an egg from being released after unprotected sex to hopefully, allow for sperm to die off before you ovulate. And so for Plan B specifically, or the levonorgestrel EC, so you may have heard it as Julie Take Action, the morning after pill by Cadence OTC, and some other generics that are out there. It works right up until that luteinizing hormone surge. So if we go back to this fancy menstrual cycle, where you'll see the luteinizing hormone is this red line here, and levonorgestrel EC, also like Plan B, Julie, the brands that you've heard of that you can buy over the counter, works right up until this little uptick here. So if you look at a regular 28-day cycle, which for many of you may be relevant to what you're experiencing each month with your menstrual cycle, potentially shorter or longer depending on your individual experience, that would be about day 10 to 14 of your cycle. So if you're um, consistent and able to sort of estimate when you're ovulating, that would be a good indicator that you are pre-ovulation and are at the maximum for LNGEC to work. Now, with ulipristal acetate, which is the prescription-only EC pill, it works a little bit longer and is actually something that you can take up to 5 days after unprotected sex. And the reason for that is because it actually works beyond that surge and goes up to that luteinizing hormone peak. So again, if we go back to this menstrual cycle and we look at this red line, Ella works right up until this point here. So if you again look at a regular 28-day cycle, sort of in between that day 12 to 14 range, depending on, how your cycle sits and whether or not you can predict your ovulation from regularity. Beyond that, the medication won't be successful in delaying ovulation. And so you've either already ovulated or it's missed its peak in order to do its mechanism of action, which means it'll have little efficacy. But what we often say to people is unless you're tracking to a T, you're using ovulation strips, all the different ways of trying to estimate when you are ovulating. Even if you're in a time period where you are unsure, it doesn't hurt to take EC. And so if you're in a situation where you've had unprotected sex, and you're trying to prevent an unintended pregnancy, take the emergency contraception. If you haven't ovulated, great. It's hopefully going to prevent that and you won't become pregnant. And if you have ovulated and didn't know, then there's no harm if you do become pregnant from taking the EC. So just to recap the difference again between EC pills and medication abortion, our EC pills are these two drugs, so levonorgestrel or ulipristal acetate, and some of the common brands you may see in stores around you are down here. So you've got option two, My Choice, Plan B One Step, and Julie, and then Ella being the brand name for the prescription EC. It's a contraception that's used after sex. So despite having emergency in its name, you can totally use it as just like a post-sex contraceptive option, especially if you don't regularly use another hormonal contraception, you didn't use a barrier contraception, or you just aren't in the practice of doing so. It cannot work if somebody is already pregnant because its only mechanism of action is to prevent that ovulation. Medication abortion is two different drugs. It's a combination of mifepristone and misoprostol, and these drugs in combination work to end a pregnancy up to approximately 11 weeks. So very different in terms of the chemicals that are used within these drugs. Okay, so Leah talked a little bit about how there's some miscommunication around having to be 18 or older to purchase EC. So that's born out of the fact that when EC was first approved way back when, it was originally approved for individuals 18 and older for OTC sale or over-the-counter sale. And that changed in 2013, 2014, depending on if you were Plan B or a generic version of levonorgestrel EC, to allow it to be sold over the counter to anybody, regardless of age, sex, gender. Um, yeah, I think that's all of them. ID, there's no ID requirements for anybody who's looking to purchase this product. After all of that happened, with the initial approval of Plan B One Step, the packaging required from 2006 to 2022, the box that you see here, which is a warning that says the product mainly works by preventing ovulation, which we now know because we just talked about the mechanism of action. So preventing that egg release. But the FDA required Plan B to include a line that says it may also prevent fertilization of a released egg, so the joining of sperm and egg or the attachment of a fertilized egg to the uterus in implantation. What we do know is that based off of its mechanism of action and the fact that it's preventing the release of the egg, the medication isn't able to prevent fertilization or the attachment and that implantation of that fertilized egg to the uterus. And those two processes right there are more indicative of what medication abortion would do. And so for many years, there was a lot of difficulty around separating out the differences in mechanism of action for what levonorgestrel EC can do over medication abortion and vice versa, which blurred the lines, especially when we talk about policy writing and how some states are starting to crack down even further on restrictive practices around abortion access. And so, after many years of engaging with scientists, researchers to support their argument to the FDA, Plan B One Step was successful in having the FDA update their drug monograph and change the language on their box to remove the sentence about fertilization and implantation because it does not apply to this medication. And so as of 23, the box now says Plan B one step works before releasing an egg from the ovary. It usually stops or delays that release. And it's a one tablet dose that contains a higher amount of levonorgestrel than the birth control pills that you may have seen or maybe use yourself to that work in a similar way to prevent pregnancy.
Yeah,
Okay.
so taking this information about how EC is not the same as medication abortion, there's actually an entire field dedicated to the way that we debunk misinformation. And so I used to be a vaccine misinformation researcher, and something that I thought was really interesting was the fact of when we say misinformation, it's what's going to come to mind over and over again, even if the person hears a fact debunking it afterwards. And so there's a way that we can prepare this information that is easy for people to digest, and it also matters in the way that we do debunk it to where people remember the fact more than the myth that we're trying to debunk. And so a little bit more about how to walk through um, debunking this information is we're going to be talking about the truth sandwich that we'll see in just a second. So when you are debunking misinformation, you're always going to want to start with a fact. I know that we're going to really want to start with the myth, such as, have you ever heard that somebody says that EC is the same as medication abortion? To resist that and actually offer a fact up of the fact that it is not, so that phrase stays with the person more so than the myth is really important, as well as sharing a warning that you are resharing a false claim. So then that person prepares themselves that again, that we're about to share is a myth rather than a fact. So again, that it'll come up in their brain more so the fact than the myth. Explain the misinformation, including, and this is really important, any tactics that helped it spread, such as what is important of where this misinformation is coming from. Is it coming from a curious student who has heard something? Is it coming from an anti-abortion individual that is spreading the? I think the context that we talk about misinformation is really important. And then finally, to finish our truth sandwich that we'll go over in just a second, replace the misinformation with correct information. So when you're talking with a person or on your social media post, replace the misinformation with correct information to leave off on a strong note. And so the next slide is the truth sandwich. So a really easy way that this can be shown is through the sandwich. So starting with a fact of like the top of our bun, again, the warning, myth, and fact. And so what we're about to show you guys is how to fit this information into a truth sandwich. And so what you would say to people in terms of having these conversations is the fact is, leading with it, emergency contraception is not abortifacient and is actually safer than many over-the-counter medications like Tylenol. So again, starting with the fact. Having a warning and myth. So you may hear people say that EC aborts a fertilized egg, but this is not true. And again, leading with the fact. So EC only works before fertilization. It is not effective once a fertilized egg implants. And so what you notice with that is that the misinformation takes a much smaller story than the facts. And I think that's so important when we're having conversations with students and with people around us who may have heard misinformation. So returning back to the bracket, so with the two other misinformations that we had, Nick had mentioned you were able to buy EC when you were under 18 years old. There is no purchasing restrictions for EC. The only ones that you may run into, and Nick, feel free to touch on this as well, is if your pharmacy um, may may have restrictions unfairly on EC and offering up misinformation about what age range you can be to access it. Any comment on that, Nick?
Yeah, so there is still in practice some pharmacies that are either not up to date on their practices or have policies in place that don't align with what the FDA has approved for over-the-counter regulation. And so you may experience that the pharmacy is saying, oh, you can't be under 18, you can't be under 16, whatever their arbitrary number is. And if you do run into that, we often say if you feel like you're in a position where you can educate them and point them to the right resources, you could tell them that they could update their practice by reading the FDA regulations, or you could absolutely reach out maybe to another local provider, a sexual health clinic, any of the advocacy groups that are in your area. Even reach out to us at AC for EC for guidance on how to, provide that education so that we can hopefully avoid these unfair restrictions in the future because they are not applicable. There is no reason for them to be asking your age, your ID, or who you're buying it for if it's not for yourself.
And we'll get into this in just a little bit about, again, not needing a prescription, not needing, being under 18, not needing an ID. And so that all kind of comes down to where you are in your access. And so another debunk for EC only works for those that weigh under 165 pounds. So we're about to break out in just a second a little bit more about this is the largest question again that I get on campus. There are no hard weight restrictions for EC products. It's all going to come down to efficacy. And I'm going to leave it over to Nick to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about the weight piece. What we love to say, Kelly, our executive director, and myself both have experience in research. Kelly has extensive experience in research. And so I always love to start with the fact that the research that suggests that weight may be a limiting factor is not ideal. It wasn't designed to answer the question of whether or not weight restricts EC. And because that evidence isn't clear, the stakes are incredibly high, so we do talk about it because we want to make sure that anybody who's trying to prevent unintended pregnancy have as many resources as they can, the education that they need to know, and the knowledge to help make decisions about their own reproductive health. And so, what some of the research suggests is that for patients with a higher weight or BMI, they recommend using Ella or an IUD, which I'll touch on in a moment. Because when we're talking about levonorgestrel EC, so that over-the-counter medication that you can walk into any pharmacy and buy yourself, there may be a loss of efficacy after 165 pounds or a BMI of greater than 26. What I want to make clear is it doesn't mean it will not work. It just means that it may work less effectively, and we're not entirely sure how much less it'll work than somebody who weighs under 165 pounds or a BMI less than 26. Previously, we talked about there being a weight restriction with Ella. And so you may have heard in the past that Ella may have lost efficacy over 194 pounds. But recently, there's been some newer research that's come out, which is a success for us in the reproductive world. And when we're talking about our reproductive health, that Ella actually likely works at any weight. And so now what we say is for individuals who have the time and the access to a provider who can provide Ella or write a prescription for Ella or an IUD if they're interested in that, and are able to access a pharmacy in order to pick up the Ella and take it within that 5 day period. That if you weigh over 165 pounds or a BMI greater than 26 and you want more of a sure um, thing in terms of preventing that pregnancy, we recommend trying to access it. But what I will say again is that Plan B one step and the generic LNG ECs, they don't stop working after 165 pounds. So if that's all you have access to, you still take it. And we're not saying it's not going to work. There's been some research about does a double dose work? It doesn't increase the efficacy. So a single dose of an LNG EC is more than enough to at least attempt to prevent pregnancy if that is your only access point. And then the third option for EC, which we haven't really talked a lot about today in this presentation, but you can learn a lot more about the IUD and some of our other presentations. And again, can reach out to us if you'd like to talk a bit more about it as an EC option. But it's the insertion of an IUD after sex within a 5 day period. And again, so one of the great things about IUDs is they work at any weight. If you're looking for long-term contraceptive coverage, you insert it, it's good for many years. And where we previously talked about the copper IUD as being the only IUD option for EC, again, there's some newer research that does suggest that the hormonal IUDs, so something like the Mirena, may also be a good fit to prevent pregnancy after sex and provide you that long-acting coverage. So the takeaway from this is weight may or may not have a factor on whether or not EC works well for you. It's not that it won't stop working, it's just that we're unclear on how much of a decrease in its efficacy exists for folks who are taking levonorgestrel EC, so that Plan B and your over-the-counter option that weigh over 165 pounds.
So, how to package this in the final call. So, the fact is, so as Nick suggested and talked about, so some research suggests that there may be weight limits for EC pills, shaping the guidelines that we see for EC recommendations. The warning and myth, you may hear people say EC does not work at all, so using an absolute for people over a certain weight, but that is not true. The fact is, research suggests weight may influence the effectiveness of EC, Because the stakes of unintended pregnancy are so significant, it is essential that individuals have access to the full range of EC options to support their reproductive autonomy. And so, what's most important is not discouraging people from pursuing EC access, because at the end of the day, as Nick said, it comes down to efficacy, and there's going to be a higher chance of unintended pregnancy if that individual does not access EC at all, rather than one of these options. So returning back to our March Madness bracket, another one that we hear is, again, there's only one reliable brand of emergency contraception. That is not true. There are several different brands and generics available, as Nick talked about, and can kind of break down that all of these that are over the counter are levonorgestrel EC. So it's all going to have the same mechanism of action that we discussed beforehand. It's all what's really coming down to is what is the price, and that can be an indicator of what you're purchasing. So, encouraging people that if there is a generic that you're getting from donations, or that your EC vending machine has, that that is just as effective as Plan B or Julie or one of the names that they might hear more frequently. I think it's really important when we have this conversation. As well as you need a prescription to buy the morning after pill. That is not true. The only one that you need a prescription for is for ursoprostol acetate, Ella. So, any levonorgestrel EC does not need a prescription. And
I will
then,
just add for levonorgestrel EC that while you don't need a prescription to buy it over the counter, depending on your insurance plan and what your state requirements are in terms of accessing it through like Medicaid, Medicare, you may require a prescription in order to get it for free. So if you're looking for that option, may just check into what your requirements are for your own individual plan and what your state regulations are.
and then to finally fill out our bracket. So another one that we hear is that I cannot use EC more than once. The actual fact is that there is no harm in taking EC more than once, but again, it will not work if you've already ovulated. So doubling up EC. Nick, if you want to talk a little bit more about people that take multiple EC.
Yeah, so sometimes you might hear I can't take it more than once, I can't take it more than one time in a year, more than one time in a month. There is no harm in taking it multiple times. If you're using it as your regular form of contraception, that's fine. Just recognize that because it has a very narrow window of when it works, which is that pre-ovulation period with either the LH surge for levonorgestrel EC or at the LH peak for Ella or ulipristal acetate, that once ovulation's already happened, if you take it, it's not going to do anything. So it can be an expensive option to continue to take it multiple times a month. And if you're interested in taking a hormonal contraception to prevent pregnancy, then there may be another option that's a better fit for you for that long-term coverage. But there is no health risk or harm if you do take it multiple times. It just won't do its job once you've passed that ovulation period and you are too early for the next cycle's ovulation.
And then the final one is that, as we call it, the morning after pill. Some people do that EC can only be taken the morning after having unprotected sex to be effective. And so we discussed with Ella, for example, that it's prescription, that is up to 5 days, correct, Nick,
Yep.
for effectiveness. And then for levonorgestrel EC, as soon as possible, that you can get it, but is effective just in decreasing efficacy up to 5 days.
Yeah, you'll likely hear a window of taking it within 72 hours.
And so both of these, our final two that this comes down to is that a large part of misinformation falls into two buckets. So the mechanism of action and regulations around accessing EC, as well as the safety in purchasing. And so overall, we think about this bracket. This might be good to go over with maybe people that are working in your EC distribution hotline or in your student organization, because when people are interacting and accessing EC, they might have questions. And so it's important that your members can offer facts as well as just overall know a little bit more about the common myths that might restrict somebody from accessing EC and just overall taking it. So. And then for our final slide, so just a little bit more about our takeaways. So again, know the facts. So knowing the EC basics for ourselves and for members so that you can easily educate or point somebody to a reputable resource. such as the EC for EC website, in which we have many different one-pagers about EC and just overall guidance. So whether it's for a person in your organization or an individual accessing EC through you to get more information. So the second one is setting boundaries. So knowing your audience. Um, in this conversation, knowing that if someone isn't receptive to your education, prioritize your safety. So if you're feeling that it is getting hostile when you are trying to offer this information, remember that sometimes the fact that you opened up the conversation is enough, but if they're not being receptive and you feel threatened, it's really important to pull out of that conversation. And then finally, EC for EC champions. With every single person that you reach, teach, and support, and debunk a piece of this misinformation, that is one person who will walk around having a new piece of information for the rest of their lives, and it can spread to their peers and increase their overall EC access, as well as contribute to combating, as we talked about, hormone phobia, and the fact that we have policymakers that are anti-contraception and in educating them as well so they can make more informed choices so we can expand EC access both on the individual and systemic level is so important. So please take rest for yourself throughout all of this, and remember that with each hard conversation there is a payoff. Yeah. So
Great.
thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you. If you have any questions, feel free to email our generic email, which is community@EC for EC. That'll get you in touch with um, all of us. So if there's a specific person on our team that may be able to answer your question, you will be redirected to them. And then if you have any questions for myself individually, feel free to email me at my second email here. Use our website and connect with us on social media.
Have a great day.
All right, stop.